Okay, I think we're on. Let's webinar. So, hey everyone, I'm Eliza Zone, and you're tuned into the last webinar in our 3 weeks of peak webinar series. And it's entitled Planning Air and Ocean Shipments During Peak Season. We've had a tremendous response to this series, and the feedback, which is always welcome, by the way, has been overwhelmingly positive. One thing we always keep in mind for these webinars is that our audience is comprised of many people who are new to freight and also many people who are already familiar with the ins and outs of freight. And it's our intention to provide both a good basic understanding of concepts and also delve in deep enough to help you make better freight choices and also save lots of money. Our final webinar today is a doozy, and we'll answer all of your burning peak season freight questions. And if your question isn't answered, just submit one using the question box on your screen, and we will try to answer it at the end of the presentation. So here's our agenda for the day. We'll start by summing up the basics. Then we'll move on to understanding freight costs and charges in general, using historic data, and then predicting peak. But first, here's a quick refresher or intro for those of you unfamiliar with Freightos. Freightos is the world's largest online freight marketplace, helping thousands of importers like you compare, book, and manage freight across over 75 providers. We help you navigate pricing with real visibility into the current market, manage all your shipments and billing in one platform, and round that off with some great technology and human support. And if you haven't already, you can sign up for a free account at freightos.com. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tal Kohn, Freight Market Pricing Analyst at Freightos and lover of the recent world champion baseball team, the Chicago Cubs. So now, without further ado, take it away, Tal.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie, for that introduction. As Ellie mentioned, my name is Tal Kohn, and I'm a Freight Market Pricing Analyst at Freightos. What I'd like to do with you today is to discuss on a high level the operations of freight and understand what really happens with your cargo as it gets shipped, then tie that back into the quotes and help us see how a quote really reflects the operations of a shipment. We'll then take a deeper look at the quotes so that we can understand what really affects the price, and that's going to help us understand what modes of shipping are affected by peak season and how. We'll wrap up then with a discussion of peak season and tie it all together. So without further ado, let's take a look at the operations of an FCL shipment. So an FCL shipment, the first thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to have your factory produce goods at the warehouse at the factory and load those goods up into a container. And then there's going to be a truck that comes, takes it over to the seaport. And at the seaport, it's going to sit waiting to actually go onto the vessel. A crane is going to come, when the cargo is ready to be loaded onto the boat. A crane operator is going to take that and put it onto the boat, and then it's going to sail across the ocean. This is your ocean freight. And then once the vessel gets to the destination port, kind of the reverse process happens. A crane operator at destination is going to take a crane and take the container off. It's going to sit in at the seaport for a couple of days while customs is cleared and you're able to arrange for the pickup of the container. And then a truck will come, take the container over to the final destination warehouse. This is kind of the simplest operational flow where the container is closed basically from the time that it leaves the factory and isn't opened up again until it gets to that final destination warehouse, and there's no extra handling or consolidation or other things that we're going to see in just a second with LCL and air. Okay, so on to LCL. Here, you're not going to be taking out of the factory a fully loaded container, but rather you're going to be taking pallets, or you're going to be taking boxes, whatever you're shipping. That's going to be picked up by a truck and taken, and not straight to the port, but to a consolidation warehouse. At the consolidation warehouse, they're going to take all of your goods, and they're not, because these boats are not shipping your boxes loose on, on the deck of the boat. Rather, they're shipping containers. Your boxes or pallets are going to be combined with those of other shippers at a consolidation warehouse and put into a container. So they're going to be moved around on forklifts. If you have loose boxes, they're going to be palletized. You may have to have some labeling done if you're shipping to Amazon. All sorts of handling things are going to be done here. And there's a lot of human touch and equipment being used to make sure that your cargo is ready to go onto the boat and travel safely and securely across the ocean, or in the case of air freight, fly safely in the cargo hold of the airplane. So these charges at the warehouse, the consolidation warehouse, are things that we here at Freightos call origin charges. And those go together with, again, this terminal handling charge that we have at the seaport, which is to say that after the consolidation warehouse is finished and your cargo is now inside of a fully loaded container, another truck will come pick up your container from there and take it to the seaport, where this whole process of going on a crane and onto the boat will happen again, now with your cargo inside of the full container. And once again, once the container gets to the destination seaport, the reverse happens, cargo comes off, and you have a deconsolidation warehouse where now the container is opened up and your goods are split out separately from everybody else's, so that a trucker can come pick up your goods only and deliver them where they want to be. So again, we have a similar kind of thing with air freight, where there's the consolidation warehouse in between and the deconsolidation warehouse in between. LCL is just an example of what happens to loose cargo in general. And you can see that there's a lot more handling of the goods going on. And in just a moment, we're going to see some sample quotes here, which are going to really demonstrate how significant of an impact all of that handling has on the overall rate that you pay, as opposed to FCL. So if we take a look at a sample FCL quote, we see that, at least in the Freightos environment, we are breaking the quote out into the 5 sections of a shipment that correspond to all of the operational effects. And it's really not just a Freightos standard. This is actually something that has to do with the Incoterms, or the terms of shipping that you agree on with your supplier and with your freight forwarder. But just looking at the quote, if we look at a complete quote, if you ask your freight forwarder to pick up from the warehouse, from the factory, wherever you're doing your production, and deliver all the way to the door, we have this first section of the pickup, the second, which is that crane operation and the storage at the origin port that we call origin terminal handling. Then you have your main leg costs. That's your ocean freight or your air freight, as in this case, we're talking FCL, so just ocean freight. When you're importing to the United States and Canada, the costs of the port costs at the destination are already included in the ocean freight. So that's displayed here in this sample quote, but as you can see, the actual value, the charge is 0 since it's included. And then you have your delivery leg. So once again, each part of this quote corresponds to one of those parts of the operations that we discussed just a moment ago. And if we now take a look at LCL, you'll see that there are a couple more line items in the origin charges and the destination charges sections in particular. And these correspond once again to the additional handling that's done at the consolidation and deconsolidation warehouses. Another thing that you might notice, which is different from FCL, where FCL, the ocean freight, the main leg, took a really big part of the overall quote. Here, the ocean freight is actually less in this particular example than each of the origin charges and the destination charges. And this is going to be really important when you're thinking about peak season and the impacts of all the volatility that's happening with the container prices and also with your air freight prices. We're going to see that LCL is going to behave a little bit differently. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a little bit of just a minute to analyze the parts of the quote which have the biggest impact on the overall bill that you're gonna pay. So if we look at FCL and air, you can see that the main freight, which is the ocean freight, where the boat is going over the sea or the airplane is going in the air internationally, accounts for, again, in just these particular examples, half or more than half of the entire quote. So if you have an increase in the ocean freight, as happens in peak season, or on the air freight, which again happens in air freight peak season, the overall price that you're going to pay is going to be very much affected um, by the fluctuations. Whereas LCL, you can see that the bulk of the charges are actually, in this example, on the destination charges, which is that destination warehouse deconsolidation. But if you take the destination and origin charges together, we're talking about 40% of the quote. And just getting the consolidated container across the ocean isn't even, again, in this particular example, isn't even 10% of the total quote. So if container prices are going up a lot, the LCL rate is not really going to be all that much affected. And so, in a certain sense, LCL is kind of going to be immune to the effects of peak season. So we're talking about peak season, and for those of you who have maybe not gone through a peak season before, let's talk about what is peak season. Why is it happening now? China exports. That's the primary, let's say, lane or mode of shipping that will be affected by peak season, or at least that's what we're talking about in this context. And it's all related to holidays. Thanksgiving in the United States, Black Friday online shopping in the end of November, and then Christmas at the end of December. People are buying out supply, buying goods at a really increased rate. And so if you're going to be selling, then you need to produce and have available in stock a lot of goods. Okay, that's wonderful. These things are happening at the end of November. So why is peak season starting already in August? Because the holiday shipping is done just ahead of Thanksgiving and Christmas. So let's say for ocean freight, we're talking 3 to 6 weeks or so ahead of the end of November. So that kind of puts us back towards October. But if you're doing all of your production of your gifts and the things that are being sold seasonally and shipping those in October and the beginning of November, what about items that are not seasonally sold specifically during the Black Friday and Christmas, but are things that you're just selling normally? Well, you have to advance ship and produce those. And that's something which causes additional demand even earlier than October and going all the way back to August. So you're going to stock up on everything starting in August and September, get yourself through the upcoming holiday season well in advance. And then you're going to switch your production to the seasonal goods and ship a little bit closer to when those goods are going to be flying off the shelf. Now, that's the case for FCL, where ocean freight takes a lot longer. And so we're talking about weeks or even months of lead time. Air freight is going to be different since everything goes much, much faster. Air freight peak season starts in November and goes on a little bit longer than the ocean freight peak season. It goes on until maybe the first week of December or the very, very, very latest, the second week of December, so that you can get your goods in store in time for Christmas. Now, as we discussed earlier, since LCL is affected so little, or rather the ocean freight component of an LCL quote is affected, has such a small effect on the overall LCL quote, LCL is kind of immune to this whole peak season rate increase. I've seen on a number of occasions where co-loaders announce, okay, peak season is coming. There are going to be rate increases, and then a week later they say, you know what, the rate increase has been canceled. It's because of the items that I mentioned earlier. In fact, that the ocean freight is such a small component of the overall quote, LCL is generally not impacted by peak season. Good. So now we know what peak season is. Let's see just how much rates can move during peak season. And let's look at last year and compare it to this year. So as I mentioned, peak season for ocean freight starts at the beginning of August, and it usually will run to the middle of October. Now, last year was a little bit different because that was the beginning of China-US trade wars, and prior to that, the ocean freight market was kind of depressed. So if we look at pricing trends as represented by the Freightos FBX, the Freightos Baltic Index, which reflects 40-foot container prices on all sorts of different lanes across the world. If we look at the China and East Asia to USA West Coast rates, all the way on the left, you can see that there's a big spike at the beginning of July. Now that is not preseason, but rather, as I said, the market was very depressed for the relative to 2017 for the beginning of 2018, and that was more of a kind of catch up, bring the market back up to its regular levels. And that's what was happening with that first little jump. But if you look at the second spike, that's what happened on August 1st. And rates went from about 1550. You can see the scale all the way on the right side of the graph here, 1500 and 2000. So rates jumped a very significant amount from somewhere around 1550 to over $2,000 just from the beginning of peak season. And then we had another additional jump in September to bring the rate levels to about where they stayed through October. Now, last year was unusual in terms of the magnitude of the jumps. Some of the peak season coincided with President Trump threatening and implementing some of the tariffs. And so the increases of the rates, everyone was trying to rush and get not just their seasonal holiday goods and their regular goods in, but everything they wanted to get in before the tariffs kicked in. So there was a lot of demand and prices went way, way up, even more than usual. But still, if you look at how much they jumped from before peak season, around 1550, to their peak, no pun intended, at around 2350 in September, that's a 50% increase. So peak season really can have a very significant impact on shipping prices. Okay, so one more comment before we go on to this year, which is that usually after the middle of October, rates already start to go down for FCL. Last year, they stayed very high once again because of the China-US trade. But what we see with those continued high prices in the November-December period last year are not typical, and you shouldn't expect them to repeat this year. Of course, who knows what's going to be with the trade war, but all else being equal, that's not typical behavior. Now you go all the way over to the right and you see what's happening this year. Well, there's no spike. What happened to peak season? I thought rates were supposed to go up. And in fact, we're seeing that they are going down. So where's the peak? Well, for FCL, once again, the China-US trade war lowered demand. Everyone before the most recent tariff that was implemented by the US on imports from China, there was this concern about, well, are tariffs going to happen? When? How much? Etc. So there was a lot of what we call advanced shipping, where people are trying, again, to get their goods over to the US as soon as possible before the trade environment changes. So since everyone's already advanced shipped earlier when the rates were lower, there's not as much volume, there isn't as much of a need for shipping goods now that we've gotten to August. So that's part of what's happening that's keeping the FCL rates down. That's been mentioned by the Journal of Commerce as a very important factor of what's going on here. In addition, because people are sensitive to the fact that they now have to pay all these tariffs on importing if they're importing from China, some people have started moving their production to other parts of the world, India, Central America, and other areas. So that, again, is at some level lowering the amount of shipping that's being done from China and the Far East to the United States. Now, air freight, what's going to happen with air freight? That's coming up in November and December again. But what's happening generally, I think this is important background to understand what may happen this year, is that the demand for air freight is down internationally, and significantly so. So rates, while they may have fluctuated a lot more, increased at various times over the course of the year, they've stayed more stable and low than they have in the past. So it's a little bit early to know what's going to happen this air peak season, because we are still a couple months away and a lot can happen. But given that the rates are already down and volumes are low, it's interesting to wonder if airlines are going to be hiking rates as much as they usually do at air freight peak season, if they're going to be able to increase the rates, if people are going to put up with that, and are they going to be willing to sacrifice when they're already kind of been hit by the general market? Are they going to be willing to sacrifice getting whatever business they can during the busier parts of the year by increasing their rates too much? And of course, there is the potential from the production of goods being moved to different geographies. It's possible that once again, imports from China will be reduced, and so air freight rates won't jump as much as in the past. Just to give you a sense, because we didn't really talk about the magnitude of the air freight increases during air freight peak season, from 1 week to the next, rates per kilogram can increase by $1 or more. And we've been at Freightos have experience with seeing rates increasing by the day, and we've heard of rates increasing also by the hour, where literally you'll call up for a quote, you'll be told one thing, or rather your freight forwarder will be told one thing, and then they'll call back a few hours later and they'll be told something different and higher. So it's a very, very volatile time of year, and even if rates are not necessarily, may not go as high as in years past, you probably want to try to avoid getting into a situation where you have to rush air freight. So, in summation, peak season's been pretty quiet so far. We have reason to believe that it will stay, let's say, not as significant, not as intense as it has been in the past. So if you're shipping FCL, it's still okay right now to go ahead and do so. LCL, once again, you're kind of immune, so you don't have to worry too much about shipping from out of China at this time of year. And despite some speculation that we can make about what's going to come for air freight peak season, you do want to try to avoid that at all costs. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something, and I'll hand it back to Ellie.
Okay, thank you, Tal. We're going to go to questions right now. There aren't many, which I think is a testament to how thoroughly and how well you presented. So, why don't we go to, do you have any freight strategies for peak season? That, I guess, were in the presentation.
So an interesting thing that people are doing for, I suppose not so much for peak season, but to avoid the tariffs, is that right now people are shipping to Mexico and then trucking things in to the United States. Really, the best strategy for peak season is to make sure that you have a good handle on your supply chain, you know what your budget is, and plan ahead. Peak season is a reality in this market, and while shippers have been very lucky this year to so far avoid it, and should try to produce as quickly as possible to continue to avoid it, you have to think about your costs of storing inventory versus your costs of production, your costs of freight. So do that analysis, plan ahead, think about how much tolerance you have for increases in FCL FCL shipping, and once again, do everything that you can to avoid that air freight peak season.
Okay, another question we have here is, should we expect any dramatic ocean price increases in the near future?
Good. So right now, it's an interesting thing. The way that rates are set is that, carriers have to report a month ahead of when they're increasing rates, that they're going to be increasing rates, and by how much. And oftentimes, what we observe is that they'll say, I'm going to increase my rates by $1,000, but that's kind of an empty threat, and the increase is never that high. Yet, that's a common practice, and what we've been seeing over this peak season is that that initial threat is not anywhere near $1,000. We're talking about, for the middle of September, people announcing $500 rate increases and things like that, which again, I don't mean to scare you with that, because oftentimes the actual increases are much lower. So if the threat is already not as high as it usually is, and we're seeing that the rates are not increasing, but are in fact decreasing here at the beginning of peak season, there's a reasonable there is reason to believe that we're not going to see drastic increases over the next couple of months. That being said, carriers are also noticing that the rates aren't going up, and they have a couple of strategies for making sure that the rates do go up, like what they call blanking sailings, which means either canceling sailings, or which means canceling sailings. And so in that way, they say, all right, instead of you being able to buy up 5,000 containers worth of space, there's only 4,000 available, and by reducing the supply, they can increase the rates in that way. That's something that we saw them do earlier on in the year, and we'll see if that's what they wind up doing to kind of get that extra profit and extra revenue that they usually are seeing during peak season.
Okay, one more. This question is about tariffs. Maybe I'll further it a little bit and ask if you think that the Trump's decision to not implement the tariffs when he said he would will have a lowering effect on peak season pricing.
That's a really good question. The trade environment has been so up in the air for so long that a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, have done their advanced shipping already, and there isn't that kind of rush in the way that there was in the past to ship, and people kind of have already been through that. I do think that since Trump has formally announced, I will not be have increasing the tariffs until after, certainly not until after the holiday season, is going to keep the rates low. Um, but I don't think that it's going to drive them lower than they are right now.
Okay, so we're gonna end the questions there. Sorry if we didn't get to yours. Please feel very free to send them to us by email. Um, but before we go, I want to end with another question, and that's kind of my question to you, and that's what's next. Our webinars, videos, and articles are made for you, and we want to know what else you want to see. So um, we'll be sending out this presentation. This actually answers another question that we got. We'll be sending out this presentation tomorrow. And we'd love if you just dropped us a line with some suggestions of what else you want to see. We're really happy um, to really cover anything that we see a lot of interest in. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and a big thanks to Tal for his really good presentation. And have a good day, everyone. Thanks again.